I'm Frank, this is payment. You know the drill by now. It's CS340, it's fall. And we're going to talk about sparse matrix factorization today. If my lights stay on. There we go. Okay, good. Cool. All right, so last time we talked about principal components analysis, basically using SVD to do an orthogonal, to get an orthogonal basis using a sequential fitting algorithm, but in one go with SVD. And we did this, we talked about PCA sort of from the ground up, talking about like PCA just as a matrix factorization model where, you know, we want ZW as, you know, approximately X. And we said, well, if we have K equals 1 in this inner product, we make Z and W share size K parts, then we know that there's a scaling problem, right? And if K is greater than 1, then there's a scaling, there's a rotation, there's a label switching problem. So the standard fix, which gives rise to classical PCA, which we're going to diverge from quite a lot in this lecture, is to use basically to specify that the rows of our matrix W are orthogonal, right? That they're unit norm and like, yeah, mutually orthogonal, so it forms a proper basis, right? And then we're going to fit them all in order, okay? The first row is going to explain the most variance or reduce the most variance depending on which perspective on PCA you take. Great. There are a couple of different perspectives on PCA and the relationship between them. Is this a yeah? So it doesn't matter actually. The point is that we're just elucidating this method of talking about PCA very clearly elucidates the assumptions that we're making when we run SVD and use it to actually produce the Z and W factors. So there are a couple of perspectives on PCA, and one is the synthesis view. That's the one that we've been taking, which is to say that we see PCA as minimizing the distance to a hyperplane, like the data distance to the hyperplane, right? The analysis view, which is more what I'm used to from statistics, maximizes the variance of the data after projection. So in other words, after you project onto this plane, there's a remaining variance, and you want to maximize the variance of the data after projection, right? And there are bonus slides that show the relationship between the two. Yeah. This analysis view, when we have orthogonality constraints, picks the hyperplane maximizing the variance in ZI space, and then you pick the W to explain as much variance in the data as possible. Okay, so basically there's a couple of different views. The point is just to remind you that we're doing a matrix factorization model where we are making explicit assumptions about the structure of W and the structure of Z. And this lecture is mostly going to be about breaking those assumptions using the tools that we've talked about throughout this course. And like, they're going to do a little bit more sort of hand-wavy neuroscience-y justification and motivation for why we might want to do this. We'll start with like how the human eye works. You know, a classic and pretty reasonable model of how the eye works is that it's, you know, a great big ball like this, that light comes in through the people up here and then goes through a bunch of cells and impacts on rods and cones, of which there are 4 basic types. There are the rods, which are sensitive to brightness. There are L, M, and S cones that are sensitive to red, green, and blue light. And here you can think of this as like some sort of normalized firing rate, and this is the wavelength of the light that comes in. So if you have, blue colored light that comes in, the S cone is likely to respond very heavily. If you have green light comes in, the M cone is going to respond more heavily. L cone is going to respond more heavily, so on and so forth. So we've got the 3 cones here, and then the 1 rod. So we've got, I guess this is D equals 4 in some sense. So we're going to have, for every individual little pixel in your retina, you're going to have a 4-dimensional quantity represented. So if our bodies or whatever, our brains or minds are evolved to deal with this kind of data, it's not an ideal basis to compute with, right? For instance, the base, it's not orthogonal, right? There's really high correlation between the L and M cone activations, right? They're basically activated by the same frequency of light, more or less, right? And in some sense, we have 4 receptors for 3 colors. That's a little bit weird way of saying it, but like really, RGB is enough, right, to construct anything that we can perceive. So why do we need these 4 receptors? We don't. And in fact, what ends up happening is there is some sort of like knowable, because of neuroscience and some fairly nasty science using cat eyeballs and that sort of stuff, you can figure out that after signals received by the rods and cones, they pass through layers of retinal ganglia and so on and so forth to produce signals, uncorrelated signals that flow up the optic nerve, okay? And here we have a 4-dimensional D equals 4 signal, and it goes down to a K equals 3-dimensional signal, which is encoded in cells that represent color occupancy or opponent colors. So there'll be a cell for light dark, there'll be a cell that responds preferentially to red or green, and a cell that responds, or cells that represent fire preferentially along the blue-yellow axis. And these opponent colors are sort of opposite colors on standard color wheels. So what's actually happening in the retinal ganglia is some sort of computation that looks a lot like PCA, which is to say it projects from a 4-dimensional input space that's not uncorrelated onto a 3-dimensional uncorrelated feature space, which would be better for subsequent computation. Cool. Okay, that's kind of cool. And just to drive this point home, for this particular pixel, your eye actually, like you've got rods in the 3 cones, you get 4 signals, right? And what comes out is some kind of a code for the actual color at that location, right? So there's going to be some retinal ganglion cell that reports brightness, or cells that report brightness that are tuned to brightness. There are going to be some retinal ganglion cells that are tuned to red versus green, and some retinal ganglion cells that are tuned to blue versus yellow. Okay, so what ends up happening is that you have the responses from each of those cells, right? That's basically what we're saying here. So there's like an array of cells. These are like layers of the retinal ganglia here, right? And in each region, there will be a set, let's pretend there's 1 cell, but probably more than that, but 1 cell for brightness, 1 cell for red, green, 1 cell for blue, yellow. And somehow the system has internally represented, either through the weights of the neural networks or so on and so forth, the system has internally represented the parts of the color space, the first row, the first principal component, the second principal component, the third principal component, which when weighted together, explain the entire 4-dimensional space from this orthogonal 3-dimensional basis, okay? That's cool, right? Okay, So the point remains, right? We have some feature space, and we'd like to build features, or I'm going to call them codes, and this is going to be the code, right? So we've got 3 numbers. That's the code that go along with the parts that explain this 4-dimensional thing. Okay, great, fine. Okay, so we'd like codes that we can process with efficiently. Maybe they're sparse. We'd like to, have codes that actually represent the object in a hierarchical, decomposed way, so that our higher cognition levels have an easier computational task to deal with, right? But before we get there, we need to sort of bust apart this canonical principal components analysis objective and training technique, so that we can build it back up in different, potentially more interesting ways. Okay, and to be fair, really, actually, there's maybe 2 or 3 other things to say here, just to say them, and hopefully they'll be heard. One is this. Okay, the 3 things are: 1, in some sense, you can kind of think of this as just as a setup for talking about recommender systems, which are the next lecture, and they're really, really powerful, and they're basically matrix factorization methods. So you can think of principal components and all this stuff that we've been talking about as a way into thinking about recommender systems, which are highly economically valuable and are the driving life force of Amazon and Facebook and Google and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. The second thing is all the stuff that we're going to, and this is in response to a posting I saw on Piazza, all the stuff that we're going to talk about today, where we break down PCA and so on and so forth, we're going to go relatively quickly. And I know that we're going relatively quickly in terms of covering the material, but all the stuff we're going to talk about today is stuff that is familiar to you. The idea of loss functions and likelihoods and regularization and not regularization, different forms of regularization, the impact that they have on things, robust versus non-robust versions of things, that sort of thing. That's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to break down the PCA thing, and then talk about different variants of it. And I've forgotten what the third one is. I'll remember it at some point as we're going. But anyway, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to break down how we actually fit the PCA thing. So, like, in linear regression, when we were talking about linear regression, we had the normal equations, right? But then we figured out that we could fit PCA with gradient descent or stochastic gradient descent, so on and so forth. And we just said, okay, well, PCA has the singular value decomposition. That's how you get the basis vectors and their weightings and so on and so forth. And that was pretty unsatisfying, right? We didn't go into it and say, go take linear algebra or read about it, or so on and so forth. But kind of the point is that what we really want to, that is actually the subject of other domains, right? How to do that. But in machine learning, we can think about breaking down PCA into different things, right? And building it up in different forms. And to do that, we need to think about fitting PCA in different ways. We can fit it with stochastic gradient descent or gradient descent itself, or so on and so forth, okay? And when we do that, we are going to throw away, and keep this in mind because I had this question last time, as we go on, like people are going to, you might think, well, where did the orthogonality constraints go? Where did the unit norm constraints go? Where did all this stuff go? Largely today, we're going to throw that away and think about what matrix factorization methods are and how to build up different factor models. Oh, yeah, the third thing is that all these latent factor models that we're talking about, when we're talking about them here, we're sort of, this is the one part of the course where we're maybe a little bit behind the curve. It's very important that you know about them because PCA is a super important technique. But if you think about this as a classifier sort of feature extraction thing that we're doing, then we're in some sense building some sort of basis manually here, right? We're doing it in an unsupervised way, but we're still building a basis for some downstream classification task. And deep learning is actually going to take this over in some sense. And we're in that particular light, we're eventually going to learn all of this stuff anyway, and we don't have to worry about a lot of this. But think about building up towards recommender systems or something like that, if that helps, when you frame them as a matrix factorization model or problem. Okay, And today, just to be clear, we're going to throw away normalization, orthogonality, ordered principal components, that sort of thing. You can always do that in post-processing, so on and so forth. Why would we want to do this? Because of all the stuff that you already know and actually do know, right? If you want to make robust versions of PCA for whatever reason, if you want to do regularized versions of PCA to get various, better generalization or so on and so forth, you want sparse PCA, binary PCA, so on and so forth. Or if you want to run PCA on really, really large data sets where running a singular value decomposition is impractical, too expensive. And the first thing that we can think about is alternating minimization instead of fitting it using a singular value decomposition. So we said with center data, the PCA objective is given by this equation here. The objective with respect to W and Z is just a sum over N, sum over D of the inner product minus the target. So this is, again, the thing that we know, and we're trying to find the W's and the Z's, right? And we've linked this to k-means, right? So when we fit k-means, we did an alternating minimization where we fix the cluster assignment Z and then find the optimal means W, right? And then we fix the means W and find the optimal cluster assignment Z, right? And we said this will converge to some local optimum, but may not find a global optimum, okay? So be it, right? Sensitive to initialization, okay? In PCA, we can fit it using alternating minimization as well. Just note, obviously, that this objective, right? Again, this is given, and these are parameters. These are the parameters we want to learn. So we can fit this using alternating minimization, where we fix the part weights Z and find optimal parts W, and then fix the parts W and find the optimal part weights Z, right? This is going to converge to a local optimum, which will be or can be a global optimum under certain technical conditions, right? Okay. In particular, if you start by randomly initializing your parameter values. So, and just to throw it out there, we don't do this very often, but let me just throw that out there. So when we say these kinds of like gross technical things, I'm like, okay, you have to do random initialization of the parameters, and then you can prove that it will be a global optimum, blah blah blah, under certain technical conditions. That's really like a massive restatement of very, very technical results from papers like the one that I just threw into the chat. So under certain technical conditions means go read the paper if you care, but okay. In order to see this, right, and we'll be a little bit fast about this as well. This objective, oh my goodness. This objective corresponds to this, right? And if you look up in the matrix cookbook, or you do your matrix algebra, so on and so forth, and you take a gradient of this thing with respect to W, you get this, okay? And if you set it equal to 0, then you get an update for W that involves the current value of Z, okay? Great. And if you take a gradient of this expression with respect to Z, you get a similar kind of expression. You set it equal to 0, and you get an update for Z. Okay. So instead of SVD, one thing that you could do is do a gradient-based alternating minimization, but the gradient-based alternating minimization actually allows you, because this is a linear model, to solve for the minimizer, the stepwise minimizer for W and Z in terms of each other. Okay, great. Okay, so now you should be able to see how to.
Is it P norm or F?
Sorry, that's Frobenius norm. Sorry, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, great. Cool. Okay. Fine. So that objective, it's not jointly convex in W and Z. You'll find different ones depending on the initialization. For instance, if you set all the parts to 0, then they'll stay at 0, right? But in the paper that I linked, you can show that all stable local optima are global optima, and it'll converge to global optima in practice if you randomly initialize. And random initialization means you don't start them on the unstable non-global critical. It's very highly technical, but basically, if you sample the initial Zs from a normal distribution, you'll probably be okay. And great, you can do this alternating minimization thing, which looks like the k-means algorithm, and uses the gradients and so on and so forth. Great, fine, cool. Okay, but you should also, okay, let's see, Payman. I don't know if we go to this next, but let's look at this. What other things, or even from the chat house of fun and doom, which is this class, right? Like what other things might you think about doing looking at this objective? This is the kind of thing that I would actually do in person if we were actually lecturing. I'd make you think, in all of us in person. So what does that make you think about?
I didn't get the question. Was it? What?
We're talking about different things to do to PCA, right?
Yeah.
Different ways to optimize. So right now we're talking about different ways to optimize the function. So
gradient, stochastic gradient, for example.
Okay, so gradient descent we just basically did, Shaunak, because we just did alternating minimization. So we minimized with respect to, so like if we go back here, we took a gradient, but we know that the gradient, yeah, okay, so stochastic gradient descent, that's good, right? So there's kind of something funny going on here, right? But that's okay, we can deal with that. So we could do stochastic gradient descent. Okay, cool. What else when you, okay, use an absolute value function instead of squaring. Okay, so that's going to change the PCA objective. How? Payman?
Finding mean for non-convex relations.
Are you reading the comments or are you answering my question? I think, yeah, okay. Oh, look at that. Oh man, look at this. They're coming in. Oh, cool. Awesome. This is amazing. Robustify it. Yeah, so you could do a robust version of PCA. Okay, what if you had binary xij's? Don't you love being put on the spot? You were like, I'm going to take this job of like sitting in lecture, just listening and, blah, blah, blah. Logisticate it. Okay, yeah, so you change the loss function, you change the likelihood function to be one that, produces binary values or whatever, and now you've got a different form of PC. So I know that not everyone who's listening in on this lecture is, going to pop out with these answers straight away. Some people integrate this stuff quickly, some people don't. It's totally cool, but if you let it flow and believe in yourself and understand, what we've been talking about at sort of a higher level, these answers will pop out. Yes, indeed. Okay. So one thing, the one that Payman popped out with, which was lovely, was stochastic gradient, right? So in stochastic gradient, we pretend that this is an average, right? And then the expected value, and then we say that's an expected value, we pass the expected value in and we compute, like stochastic gradient applies when we pull one out of the sample set of n times d samples. So if we look at this as a sum over I and j of the columns of W and the rows of Z, in particular, the xij element, the ijth element of the matrix, right? So we can just pick one of the elements of the matrix and look at that squared loss there as a single loss function, right? Okay, so we can just pick one of those or a mini batch of those, right? Example I and feature is j, and then do a gradient step on this one little loss term, right? So you do a gradient step by taking a gradient or a derivative of that expression. This is a gradient because it's a vector with respect to the column wj, fine, right? And then you set z to be a gradient step of the gradient of this thing with respect to zi as well. Done. Okay, so now we've got a beautiful stochastic gradient algorithm, and it's very, very cheap per iteration because that's a dot product between k-dimensional vectors, right? It's beautiful, cool. Awesome, okay? Questions at this point? I'll leave it on this, but questions? Great. So here comes some hand-wavy neuroscience-y crap, but it's actually, you know, not so crappy, and it's not so hand-wavy at the end of the day, but it's, you know, something to think about. So how should we represent a face? Payman, what are the features of a face? What are the two circles and a curve? Yeah, okay.
Yes, there's like components, eyes and maybe nose, mouth. These are the important stuff.
So yeah, so the features of faces are you've got a beard, you've got dark hair, you've got a hairline that's much better than mine, you know, you've got, you know, your face is made of parts, and those parts can be described by the parts that those parts are made of, and so on and so forth, right? Fine. So how should we represent them? Right? Now, so one way that you could represent the space of faces is to do vector quantization. You have k faces, right? You just replace a face by the average face in whatever the however many clusters there are. And in particular, if you go crazy and you say that there are, k is as many faces as there absolutely are, right? Then the basis that you have is that there's, you know, one face model, mean, basis, whatever you want to call it, for every individual you've ever seen, or every individual in the world, right? And then your code is incredibly sparse, right? You have some code that you use to index everybody's face, and like when you identify Payman or try to encode Payman's face, you use the Payman feature. There's the Payman feature. It's 1 if it's Payman and 0 if it's anybody else, and it's 1 if it's me and 0 if it's anybody else, so on and so forth, okay? Now, we're simultaneously introducing a bunch of stuff. I already said that I'm going to call these things the code, right? So I'm going to encode this face with the single face that it is and nothing else, right? That's what's known as a grandmother cell. And when you think about coding in the neuroscience sense, you think about like, how do you represent some feature space using the firing activity of a bunch of neurons, right? And if you have one cell for every face you ever see, and that cell is trained to recognize exactly that face and that face only, then we call that a grandmother cell, because everybody has a grandmother cell. Like you just recognize everyone by being that person, one neuron, one face. And this is not maybe the best idea, right? Because, well, the real problem for that is that if that cell dies, then you can no longer recognize your grandmother. But more to the point, if you don't have 7 billion neurons, you know, assigned to represent all the faces you could possibly ever see, then if you cluster people's faces together, then you can't distinguish between people in the same cluster, right? Okay. You can only, there's only k possible kinds of faces, and this is going to lead to all sorts of very bad generalization, right? Okay, so it's almost certainly not true. You've got too few neurons to represent such a code. We've been talking about PCA, right? So we represent a face as a global average plus a linear combination of eigenfaces. So the code is going to, again, be these numbers, right? So that's the code that's going to be represented somehow, right? Now you can represent an infinite number of faces. You can represent a continuum over faces by changing the code. That's cool. And you can keep it relatively small. But according to what you all said in the chat channel and what Payman said as well, is that, you know, eigenfaces or the PCA basis is not an intuitive ingredient for representing faces, right? In particular, PCA uses positive and negative components, and it doesn't really make sense to have like a negative face part, right? Just you have a nose and then a little bit more nose or whatever, right? Okay. So non-negative matrix factorization is a different approach, right? Which basically says instead of imposing orthogonality or some sort of ordering on W, we're just going to make it so that the W and Z are non-negative. That's it. So in other words, you have to just add. That's it. And these all have to be positive, and these all have to be positive as well. And you still have to build a basis for faces. Okay. Cool. What this gives rise to is what we would call a sparse code, right? So the Zs, for various technical reasons, are going to end up being sparse. Okay. In other words, if you're thinking in terms of hand-wavy neuroscience-y things, the number of neurons that actually have to do something that has a physiological cost, has an energy cost, is low, right? And those sparse activations tend to correspond to, parts of the image. A face is built of a nose and a stage left cheek and a chin. Like, okay, you can argue that these are more part-like than the other ones or not, but you get the idea. Okay. So why sparse coding? Right. Parts are intuitive. Yeah, I see. It seems like the RBF basis. Maybe, yeah, maybe. I don't think so. It's a different deal, right? The parts are intuitive. The brain definitely uses some sort of sparse representation. The neurons are very sparsely active, right? So they're energy efficient because the brain is energy efficient because it uses a sparse code. Maybe it's actually a more efficient way to represent information. There's some evidence of this that comes out of studies of the fruit fly olfactory system. Fine. So here we have NMF learned parts. These are the weights, and this is the face that you get by combining these parts, basically. Okay.
Are these unique with this non-negativity as constraint?
No, not when we're doing this, and we'll get to that in just a second. Okay. And why? But we're gonna baby steps into this, and then we'll get there. Okay. So let's talk about least squares, not PCA. We'll talk about least squares. Okay. Great. Let's do our usual least squares. So great. But here we're going to assume that the y's and the x's are non-negative. Okay. It could be sizes or count, something like that, where it doesn't make any sense for them to be, somebody to be negative 153 centimeters tall. Doesn't, right? Fine. And we're going to assume that we want, and this is just for pedagogical purposes, basically, the W to be non-negative as well, in that there's, there's no sensible interpretation for negative weights, right? Fine. So if X is the amount of a product you produce, what is some weight that's negative on that mean? It doesn't make any sense. The point, though, is that non-negativity. So is this like each neuron is a Mr. Potato Head part? So yes, so that's basically what we're going for here. So again, modulo deep learning, right? There's still computational neuroscience and real neuroscience that looks at the activations of cells. And it would be really cool if our machine learning models, particularly for AI applications or more complicated classification examples, used features that were similar to the features that humans used in order to make judgments, because then the model would be more aligned with human performance, so on and so forth, right? Are we using milk as a unit of size? Okay, fancy, I'm going with gallons here just to piss everybody off. Great. Yeah, so basically the sparse code is going to represent the parts of a Mr. Potato Head. That's not a bad way of talking about it. Okay. The point here, though, is that non-negativity leads to sparsity. Okay, and this can be seen in the following thing. It's going to be a lot like the L1 regularization stuff that we did before. As you'll see in just a second, So here's our least squares objective. That's our standard thing. We're assuming that the weight, the regression weight is positive, right? If we plot the loss function, the unconstrained minimum is here, and now this is a function of W. If for whatever set of x, y, whichever, if under the data we have, the unconstrained minimum happens to live in the positive orthant, then the non-negative least square solution is the least square solution. Done. Okay. If, on the other hand, the unconstrained minimum lives in the negative orthant, then the minimum of our objective is actually at W equals 0. Okay. So the non-negative solution is a hard W equals 0. Okay. So this means that similar to L1 regularization, non-negativity leads to sparsity. It turns out that it also regularizes, because when you can't cancel negative values, you really can't have really big W's, right? And again, just in terms of energy and like kind of neuroscience-y hand-wavy things, when you have sparse representations, you have lots of hard zeros, and that means that it's cheaper to make predictions if you don't compute with zeros. It often leads to more interpretable part-space representations, right? So the question is, how can we minimize a loss function with non-negative constraints? Don't do this. The naive approach is to solve the least squares problems and then just set all of the negative W's to 0. The correct thing to do is to run projected gradients, which we're not going to go into great detail here. We're just going to say this exists. You should look them up if you're interested. This is 540 material big time. So projected gradient works like this. You run gradient descent, whichever version you want. Run a gradient descent iteration. Gradient, step size, half step. And then after every half step, set the negative values to 0, okay? And then rinse and repeat, okay? So this basically just says, if it's negative, set it to 0, move on, okay? So the projected gradient algorithm has similar properties to the gradient descent. It's going to guarantee decrease of f if the step size is small enough, of your objective of f if the step size is small enough. Reaches a local minimum under weak assumptions, global minimum for convex f, so on and so forth. And again, 540 material, a generalization of it is called the proximal gradient algorithm. Enough about that. Let's go back to non-negative matrix factorization and say, okay, here's our loss, but we want to have all of our parameters be greater than 0. And I just told you about projected gradients as an algorithm. It couldn't be simpler, right? So now we can use projected gradients in a lot of different ways, right? So we can do projected gradient steps on W and Z like we did before, or we can run projected gradient on both of them at the same time, or we can do stochastic projected gradient, right? So we did the stochastic gradient update for W and Z at selected values of I and J, while we're keeping all the other W's and Z's fixed. And then when you take the step, you just set all the negative values to 0. That's pretty cool. And this is in response to the earlier question, right? This is non-convex and sensitive to initialization. It's hard to find a global optimum. Great, fine, so on and so forth. But what do you get for it? Well, now you can look at data in sort of sensible ways, right? So if you take a kernel density estimate of Stephen Curry's and LeBron James shots, here's more basketball, right? And you build a non-negative matrix factorization based model of different shooters' preferences, so on and so forth, you're going to find these parts, which is pretty cool, right? It's not terribly surprising that there are some players, you know, low post players that only shoot near the basket, and then there are people like James Harden and other long-range shooters whose preference is way out at the three-point line, okay? Near the top of the key. Cool. Yes, Harden and his antics. We'll leave that alone. Anyway, okay. So we've got our objective for latent factor models, linear latent factor models in particular. As before, we can replace this loss with all kinds of different things, right? The loss is basically just the error for predicting, you know, this inner product, that's our, x hat ij, when the true value is xij. So if we have binary data, +1, -1, we could use a logistic loss here, right? If we have Poisson, we could do a Poisson, a loss based on a Poisson likelihood, so count data, so on and so forth, right? Ordinal data will show up when we do recommender systems and that sort of thing, okay? Fine. We can, as suggested, do robust PCA. We can replace the squared method with the absolute error. And this means that, the residuals are encouraged to be exactly 0. So if you apply robust PCA to video frames, right, you're going to get something like this, where the reconstruction of this thing ignores outliers, and you can use this for background subtraction in videos, and that sort of thing is cool. A little hilarious political commentary. There's a paper that ran PCA on images of Miss Korea pageant entrants, and they found, I believe, I didn't reread the paper this year, but I believe from years past when I looked this up, I believe that they found that 2 principal components was enough to explain most of the variation in robust PCA, which is to say there's the low rank reconstruction. The sparse error is basically, if you notice, really actually only the direction in which the hair was parted. Other than that, it's I'm not going to. That's not safe space. I do not approve of non-safe space commentary. Take it private. But yeah. Okay. Cool. So, like we've been talking about, so you can do all your standard stuff, right? So you can do L2 regularized PCA that replaces normalization, orthogonality, sequential fitting. You need some regularization parameters. You have to regularize because of the scaling problem, which we've already talked about. Yeah, fine. We can do sparse matrix factorization using L1 regularization. So we can put L1 priors on these. This is called sparse coding if you put L1 on Z, or sparse dictionary learning if you put L1 on W. There's some disadvantages of L1 regularization over non-negativity. Sparsity is controlled by hyperparameters. There's some advantages, which is that the sparsity is controlled by hyperparameters, so you can control the amount of sparsity. Sometimes negative coefficients, which this allows, do actually make sense. And what does it look like in practice, right? So here are the eigenfaces again, except where we've got blue are negative and red are positive. So here's the standard PCA basis. This is dictionary learning, which is just PCA without the orthogonality constraint. This is non-negative matrix factorization, and this is sparsity due to L1 regularization, okay? And just like every one of the machine learning models we've talked about throughout the entire course, if you ask me which one is the right one or the best one or something like that, I'll reach through my computer monitor and give you the standard answer of, oh, we don't know. It depends on the data set, right? But all of these are available as latent feature extraction techniques. Cool. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a billion variations, right? So you can do mixes of L2 and L1 regularization. You can do K singular value decomposition, which it constrains each Z to have at most K non-zeros. Fine, okay, there's a bunch of stuff, okay? If you're really interested in sort of part space, if you're interested in part-based representations and feature learning, you can look up recent work or relatively recent work on structured sparsity, and this basically actually puts constraints on the parts themselves. Okay, that's it. Cool. So we gave kind of a hand-wavy biological motivation for orthogonal or sparse latent vectors. We talked about different ways to optimize the PCA objective, alternating minimization, stochastic gradient. we said, look, be confident, you know a bunch of tricks from the other part of the course, the previous part of the course. So, the other thing we talked about new is projected gradient, but like you can set up non-negative matrix factorization in a bunch of different ways. Many of the regression tricks we talked about elsewhere can be used for bust PCA, L1 regularization leading to sparse factors and weights, so on and so forth. And next time we're going to talk about recommender systems and matrix factorization models for solving the $1 million Netflix prize. In what case refer to, so the question is, in what case would dictionary learning be better than orthogonal? Refer to the comment from Nico above, which says, I'll reach through your computer screen and give you the standard answer. So there, I assume you're yanking my chain by asking that question, but if not, the slightly less snarky answer is dictionary learning allows you to learn not using the SVD, right? So you can do gradient descent and that sort of thing, and you can learn super fast by ignoring those things. So in that sense, dictionary learning is preferable in very large data sets, right? For dictionary learning, why does the for dictionary learning, like we really have no idea what's going to come out, right? You have correlated features, exactly what Amit has said here. So like for dictionary learning, why does it seem like the data looks less detailed? Is it because of the loss of orthogonality? Everything's fair game here. Your basis vectors are going to be all over the place. They might not even be scaled correctly, probably aren't scaled correctly, right? So really, who knows what's going on here, right? So like, how do you even plot these? I don't remember the source for this, whether or not they even scale these correctly, right? So you'd have to rescale these in some sort of arbitrary way, even to plot them, because you're going to have arbitrary scaling on the basis vectors. So I don't think you should take too much out of this. When can we expect to get the full details about the final? Probably this Friday, would be my guess. Yeah. Still putting it together. Yep. Cool. Any other questions? Payment?
Thank you.
Okay. I think we'll call it a day then. Thank you all for your time and attention.